Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine the air inside that room in Jerusalem. Heavy, almost motionless. The smell of burning oil from a small earthen lamp still clung to the walls, the dim light trembling over jagged limestone. You don't hear singing. Don't listen to prayer out loud, just contained breathing, just short steps. Just the dry sound of someone turning quickly each time a noise comes from outside. That's where it all starts. Not with triumph, not with courage, not for sure, but with broken men, squeezed into a closed space, trying to understand how the world collapsed in a few hours. Archaeological evidence shows that first-century Jerusalem homes used stone walls, simple lime or packed earth floors, carved niches for lamps, and doors reinforced with heavy wooden latches. This matters because it returns the scene to the real ground. This is not a polite religious picture. It's a group hiding in a cramped interior, afraid of being the next to disappear. You feel this fear before you even understand faith. Jesus had died in a public, humiliating, Roman way. Cruz wasn't just about execution. It was a warning. It was the empire saying, this is what happens to those who threaten order. And now those who followed him carried the fresh memory of the escape, the scream of the crowd, the wood, the blood, the shame. The trauma was still hot. The body had not yet managed to catch up with the mind, or perhaps the mind had not yet been able to accept what the eyes saw. But it's not just sadness. It's something more confusing, more human. Because at the back of that room, there is not just mourning. There is shock, there is guilt, there is an almost offensive hope trying to survive inside them, and they don't know what to do with it. Each silence seems to ask the same thing. What if it's really over? And another voice, weaker, almost suffocated, whispers, but what if it isn't? And that changes everything, because the disciples' first emotional state after the crucifixion was not victorious faith. It was disorientation. It was the heart trying to protect itself from the impossible. It was the mind refusing any hope that could hurt again. Take a closer look. The lamp wavers. Someone avoids looking at Pedro for a long time. Another sits down, gets up, sits down again. No one knows whether to flee before dawn or stay where they are. The group still exists, but almost as a body without an axis. And for now, the only thing stronger than hope is fear. Morning arrives, but it brings no relief. Light enters in thin bands through the house's openings, cutting through the dust suspended in the air, and yet the room remains dark inside. You feel it almost physically. The body is there, but the mind seems delayed, as if it were still stuck in the previous day, and then the first reports begin to circulate. The tomb, the stone removed, the absence of the body, hurried voices, steps, broken sentences. Someone saw it, someone heard, someone swears it wasn't imagination. But no one in that group can take it as simple news, because when the pain is too great, even hope scares. The Gospels preserve exactly this uncomfortable reaction. They do not present triumphant disciples from the first moment. They feature men and women trying to filter impossible news through a wounded mind. Evidence suggests that in the first century Jewish context, the common expectation was not that of an individual, mid-story resurrection taking place with a recently executed master. The most widespread belief among many Jews was a collective resurrection at the end of time, not that abrupt break in the present. This means that even those who loved Jesus did not have an emotional category ready to process that. And that makes the scene even more human, because what comes to them doesn't initially sound like certainty. Sounds like a dangerous rumor. Archaeologists discovered that Jewish tombs from that period, especially around Jerusalem, were excavated in limestone, enclosed by heavy stones, with small chambers intended for family burial. Everything about this type of burial communicated purpose. Closing. A body placed there was a body left to die. That's why the empty tomb didn't solve the problem. In fact, it created another one. If the body isn't there, what does that mean? Desecration? Theft? Interference from authorities? Mistake? Hope? No one can decide quickly, because each possibility opens a new wound. But that's not all. The group is not just trying to discern facts. You are trying to survive them psychologically. Can you imagine the tension? A story lights up your chest for a second, but instinct soon responds. Don't believe it so quickly. Don't give in. Don't create expectations. Don't be destroyed again. It is the heart mounting a defense against the very possibility of the miracle. And this explains why the news of the resurrection does not produce immediate euphoria. Produces with tension. It produces hesitation. It produces a silent war between what they desperately want to be true and what seems too rational to win. Look closer and you'll see the most real conflict of all. They want to believe, but they also want to protect themselves. So no one moves firmly yet. No one transforms all at once. Hope entered the room, yes, but it entered as a light too weak to dispel the trauma immediately. And at that moment, the most painful truth is this: the human heart sometimes takes a while to accept even its own redemption. Now, the room is quieter than before, not because the pain lessened, but because certain memories started to feel too loud inside. You see this in the way no one holds certain looks for long. There are losses that hurt, and there are losses that accuse. What weighs heavily in that room is not just the absence of Jesus, it's the memory of what each one did when the pressure came, or what he didn't do. Pedro may still be able to hear his own voice denying it, not once, but 3, like quick, instinctive, like someone trying to save their own skin while everything falls apart. And then, on top of this memory, another, even more cruel one, the look of Jesus. Non-violent, not furious, just true. That kind of memory doesn't pass quickly. It comes back in waves. She bites inside. It turns silence into judgment. And Pedro is not alone in this. The others also ran. Gethsemane was not just the place of prison. It was the place of dispersion. It was there that the group's emotional fidelity found its real limit. They had promised permanence, loyalty, delivery. But when the glow of torches appeared among the olive trees and the sound of Roman sandals crushed the earth of the garden, the body reacted before courage. Running away was faster than staying. Protecting yourself came before understanding. And here's what changes everything. Their guilt was not abstract. It was concrete. There was a scene. It had sound. There was time. It had a face. Evidence suggests that the Garden of Gethsemane was in an area at the foot of the Mount of Olives, surrounded by ancient olive presses and olive trees, an environment known for groups that needed to congregate outside the most heavily guarded areas of the city. This matters because it gives historical weight back to the escape. They did not fail in a symbol. They failed in a real place on a real night, hearing real footsteps approaching. Their trauma has geography, and the guilt too. There is yet another, more painful layer. Some were not at the foot of the cross. Some didn't stay to watch until the end. Scholars estimate that Roman crucifixion was deliberately public and brutal in its psychological function, to humiliate the condemned and intimidate any sympathizers. This helps explain the fear, but does not eliminate the shame, because the human heart can understand its own fear and still condemn itself for it. This is what makes the disciples so close to us. They are not suffering just because they lost the Master. They are suffering because just when they thought they would be more faithful, they discovered something terrible about themselves. They discovered they were smaller than they thought, more fragile, more unstable, more human. And that hurts in a special way. You feel it in the room. A man leaning against the wall, very still. Another avoiding talking about the previous night. Another clinging to small details, as if the mind would rather organize objects than face the moral chaos within. Nobody needs to accuse anyone. The entire group is already being accused of memory. But that's not all, because guilt doesn't just destroy the past. She also sabotages the future. How do you come back to believe that you can still be used after having failed at the decisive moment? How does one receive news of hope when they feel unworthy of even hearing it? How does Peter hear any rumor about resurrection without another voice coming through him first? You didn't deserve to be among his people? This is perhaps one of the most hidden pains of those days. Not just Jesus died, but I failed him before that. And when guilt enters a room, it changes the air. Archaeologists discovered that many urban houses in Jerusalem in the first century had compact rooms around small inner courtyards with tight circulation and little privacy. In a space like this, no one really hides. You can shut up, you can turn your face away, you can sleep on your side. But he can't completely escape the presence of others, and perhaps that was one of the hardest parts. Carrying shame in a group. Every breath there was reminiscent of an absence. Each silence resembled an escape. Every look remembered a broken promise. And at that stage, the disciples did not yet look like men about to change the world. They seemed much more real. They looked like ordinary people trying to breathe under the unbearable weight of having loved Jesus and failed him at the same time. The news has already arrived. Some they heard too much to call it a coincidence. Others heard enough to lose sleep, but not enough to rest their souls. The empty tomb can no longer be ignored. The women's stories still resonate. There is movement. There are rumors. There are too many pieces moving at once. And yet, when you step back into that room, nothing feels victorious. The door remains closed. The lock remains in place. The body remains on alert. This is what most people don't imagine. Even after the reports, the fear does not evaporate. It remains in the environment like smoke after a fire, because trauma does not obey logic. You can hear extraordinary news and still continue to wait for the next violent knock on the door. You can receive a sign of hope and still keep your shoulder tense, your breathing short, your eyes focused on the entrance. And it was exactly like that. The Gospels describe the disciples gathering behind closed doors out of fear. This little piece of information carries enormous weight. We are not seeing a group already stabilized by faith. We are seeing men who still calculate risk, still anticipate persecution, still think like survivors. Jesus was executed by Roman power with the support of local leaders. In their minds, the sequence seemed obvious. First the master, then the closest followers. Evidence suggests that doors to urban houses in the first century, especially in Jerusalem, could be made of thick planks reinforced by crossbars, with simple but firm internal locking systems. This is not a decorative detail. This brings reality back to the text. The closed door is not just a symbol, it's strategy. It's a physical object between them and the street. Wood, weight, friction, barrier. Faith has not yet replaced the instinct of self-preservation, and that makes the scene more honest. Because their fear was not a lack of love, it was a consequence of exposure. Look closer. Every sound coming from outside changes the atmosphere inside. Sandals passing over the stone street, male voices in low conversation, an animal pulling a load, the crack of wood in some neighboring house. Common sounds of Jerusalem at the time of the festival, but inside everything seems like a potential threat. Archaeologists discovered that the city in the Second Temple period was densely occupied, with narrow streets, shared courtyards, and intense circulation of pilgrims at major celebrations. In an environment like this, no one really feels invisible. There are always eyes, always rumors, always at risk of being recognized. But that's not all. Their fear now no longer comes only from outside. It comes from within too. Because believing can become dangerous in a new way. If you give in to the possibility that Jesus is alive, then you will have to rethink everything. You will have to come out of the state of mourning. You will have to face your own guilt. You will have to admit that the end may not have been the end. And that seems beautiful when told later. But at that moment, it was ominous. Because true hope demands more of you than despair. Desperation only paralyzes. Hope calls. And they weren't ready to be called up yet. That's why this moment breaks the idealized image. The resurrection did not instantly transform the disciples into intrepid men. For a time, faith and fear coexisted in the same body. The memory of the cross still burned. The political threat still seemed real. The guilt still spoke. The mind still sought protection. The miracle had already happened, but their souls were still on their way to achieving it. Scholars estimate that victims of acute trauma often oscillate between hypervigilance and cognitive hesitation, alternating between overreading the danger and difficulty integrating new information. Even without imposing clinical language on the biblical text, this observation helps to perceive the human depth of the scene. Disciples are not cold or irrational. They are injured, and injured people rarely change their state in a single instant. Then observe the group more closely. One of them speaks too softly, as if loud words could attract attention. Another insists on repeating details of the reports, trying to find stability in the facts. Another remains near the door, not out of courage, but because he wants to hear anyone approaching before the others. Maybe someone will cry in silence. Maybe someone else won't cry anymore, and that would be even worse. Because this is the turning point. They have heard enough not to remain exactly as they were before, but they are still too afraid to become what they will be after. And this transition is painful. The room, at that moment, does not house ready-made heroes. It shelters divided men, half pulled by the memory of horror, half pulled by a hope that still seems too big to touch. And perhaps that is precisely what makes this story so close. Because there are moments when God has already started to act, but your heart is still behind the door. Time passes, but not cleanly. Inside that house, the hours don't feel like hours. It feels like gaps between decisions that no one wants to make first. The light changes on the stone walls. The lamp needs to be adjusted again. The smell of the environment mixes oil, dust, used fabric, dried sweat, almost untouched food. And you realize an uncomfortable truth. After the shock, after the reports, after the guilt, comes an even more difficult moment. Someone needs to decide what to do now. Stay in Jerusalem? Leave before they are found? Wait in silence? Return to Galilee? Disappear in the party crowd? Or stay together without knowing why? This is where the group reveals its deepest humanity. Because when the mind cannot control events, it at least tries to control the next movement. Human beings do this all the time. When you don't understand what's happening, you decide about space, about route, about permanence, about escape. It's a way of breathing within the chaos. And now the tension shifts. The question is no longer just, is he resurrected? The question starts to become, and what do we do if this is true? This is the painful transition. Because while everything was mourning, the paralysis made sense. But when the possibility of resurrection enters the room, even in a fragmented way, inertia becomes more difficult to sustain. Staying still also becomes a choice, and perhaps too heavy a choice. You feel the environment change. Someone suggests caution. Another thinks about leaving. Another may want to return to what he knows, to the lake, to the hammocks, to the old routine, not because he has stopped loving Jesus, but because the routine seems less frightening than the incomprehensible. Evidence suggests that Jerusalem during the Easter period was intensely crowded, with pilgrims scattered throughout neighborhoods, rented houses, courtyards, and areas close to the temple. In practical terms, this created both risk and opportunity. A small group could try to blend in and leave discreetly, but it could also be observed, recognized, denounced. This urban density makes the decision even more tense. Staying was risky, runaway too, and this explains the group's emotional instability. There was no obvious way out. Archaeologists discovered that many first-century travelers traversed the routes between Jerusalem and Galilee on foot, in multi-day journeys, using paths known to caravans and pilgrims. This means that leaving was not a simple reaction. It required preparation, exposure on the road, provision, joint decision, or separation. Escaping meant moving at a time when perhaps one's own body was still collapsing inside. But that's not all, because there was something stronger than the fear of the street, the fear of breaking up for good. If some left and others stayed, the group could dissolve completely. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this moment so delicate. They are not yet aligned with full conviction, but they are beginning to realize that if they lose each other's presence, they will also lose the last emotional structure they have left. Staying together, even without clarity, becomes a kind of survival, not just spiritual, human. So you can almost see the scene. A man sitting near the wall thinking about the road, another walking in short steps, unable to stay still. Another argues that it is better to wait a little longer. Perhaps someone will repeat Jesus' words trying to remember if there were any instructions that make sense now. Perhaps another will simply say what many are feeling without the courage to say, I don't know what to do anymore. And that phrase in that context is not weakness and truth. Scholars estimate that groups under extreme pressure often enter a state of suspended decision-making in which no option seems safe enough to undertake with conviction. This helps to understand the post-resurrection in a less idealized way. The disciples did not go from trauma to the mission like turning a key. They had to go through the fog. They had to inhabit the break. They had to continue breathing without yet knowing what the next stable step would be. And perhaps this is one of the most important parts of the entire story. The group was not rebuilt first by strategy. It was rebuilt for permanence. Before they became an aligned witness, they were just that. Men trying not to completely fall apart. Men choosing, almost without realizing it, not to abandon each other in the middle of the confusion. Men who still didn't have the courage to move forward, but were beginning to understand that going back might no longer be possible. And sometimes that's how transformation begins, not with force, not with complete clarity, but with a small decision not to run away yet. Then it happens. Not as a public outburst, not like a parade, not as an immediate rematch against Rome. The transformation begins inside a closed room. You feel the weight of this scene even before you and understand what it means. The air is still tense. The wooden door still separates the group from the street. The shoulders are still stiff. No one there seems ready to make big declarations. And it is precisely in this environment of defense, guilt, and vigilance that the presence of Jesus breaks what they were unable to break alone. Because the first miracle after the resurrection was not just appearing alive. It went through their emotional protection system. The texts preserve something impressive. Jesus does not find heroic disciples waiting for him in an open square. He finds a group withdrawn, afraid, still caught between shock and self-preservation. This completely changes the reading of the scene. He does not appear to reward courage. It appears to rebuild people who still don't know how to breathe normally again. And here's what most people miss. His presence does not instantly eliminate all pain, but it begins to reorganize the chaos inside. Firstly, because the mere sight of the resurrected body confronts the logic of trauma, the hands, the side, materiality. Not an abstract idea, not a comforting memory, a real body before them. Evidence suggests that urban homes in Jerusalem in the first century had rooms small enough to make any sudden presence physically impactful. In a space like this, you don't contemplate from a distance. You feel the closeness. Breathing changes. The entire body responds. Faith, at that moment, does not enter as a concept. It invades the environment, and Jesus does not ignore fear. He talks to him. This is decisive. He does not arrive demanding immediate spiritual performance. Don't humiliate. It doesn't expose their fault first. It stabilizes the room. Bring peace before charging mission. This shows that the reconstruction of the disciples was progressive, almost therapeutic in its human depth. Presence comes before performance. The encounter comes before public courage. But that's not all, because the hardest defense wasn't the door. It was their inside. Pedro needed more than news. Thomas needed more than indirect testimony. The others needed more than repeated rumors. They needed contact. They needed confirmation. They needed to be reached at the exact point where they had broken. Scholars estimate that experiences of collective terror produce internal fragmentation, and that the restoration of trust often depends on repetition, presence, and relational security. Without transforming the gospel into clinical language, this helps to perceive the beauty of the process. Jesus reappears, speaks, shows, remains, eats with them, walks with them. The change does not come as a one-time shock. It comes as a patient reconstruction, Archaeologists discovered limestone containers in first-century Jewish contexts, used precisely because they preserved ritual purity. This detail is important here because it reminds us of something essential. Those disciples lived in a concrete, tactile, material world, and it is in this same material world that the resurrection finds them. Not above real life, but within it. Inside rooms, meals, roads, margins, gestures, and then the big reveal appears. They did not become immovable because they were naturally strong. They became firm because they were found while they were still broken. Their courage was not born of personality. It was born from presence. And perhaps that's what makes this scene so transformative. Because the resurrected Christ does not wait for you to resolve your fear before approaching. He enters precisely where the fear is. And then something starts to change, not all at once. Not like a sudden flame that erases every shadow, but like dawn slowly entering through a narrow crack, until what was just an outline finally begins to take shape. When you look at the disciples at this moment, you no longer just see hidden men. There is still memory of the shame. The escape mark still exists. There is still the echo of the cross. But now there is something else in the middle of it all, a shared presence that reorganizes the group from within. They start talking about the same event without the same panic. They begin to remember Jesus without falling apart in the same way. They begin to stay with each other, not just out of fear of the street, but because of a hope that little by little is becoming common among them. And this raises a question. What turns a wounded group into an aligned body? It's not temperament. It is not natural discipline. It's not leadership talent. It is pain crossed together and reinterpreted by the presence of the resurrected one. Evidence suggests that shared meals in the first century Jewish world had profound social and spiritual weight. Sitting down, sharing bread, drinking from the same container, repeating known blessings, all of this reaffirmed belonging. And this helps to understand why Jesus' encounters with his disciples in such concrete contexts at the table, on the road, by the sea, were so powerful. Their restoration did not happen just through ideas. It also happened due to renewed coexistence. Archaeologists discovered dining rooms, stone and ceramic containers, and domestic arrangements in the Second Temple period that show how collective life was built around simple, repeated gestures. This matters because it reveals something profound. God rebuilt that group on the ground in real life, in common rooms, in food touched with hands, in recognized voices, in shared silence. But that's not all. The group begins to align when each realizes that their personal failure was no longer the center of the story. Peter is no longer just the man who denied. Thomas is no longer just the man who hesitated. The others are no longer just those who fled. Now they are witnesses under reconstruction. This changes their stance. They are not men without scars yet, but they are men with direction. And there is a huge difference between being intact and being realigned. Intact is someone who has never been broken. Realigned is who was broken and was put back in the right place. Look closer. The atmosphere no longer seems like a group about to dissolve. The voices begin to carry the same center. The eyes no longer avoid the past as much because the past is being absorbed by something bigger. Unity is not born from their perfection. It is born from the fact that all have fallen, all have been confronted, and all are now being called to the same hope. And perhaps that is the true miracle of this phase. Before becoming a force in the world, they needed to become one body again. And now the story is no longer just in that room. She is in you. Because deep down, the disciples did not just experience an event that was impossible to explain. They experienced something that the human heart knows very well, the collapse between what you expected from God and what actually happened before your eyes. They loved Jesus. They trusted him. They had left a lot to follow him. And yet, they reached a point where they couldn't process reality itself. Grief confused, the guilt crushed, fear paralyzed, hope seemed too dangerous to embrace immediately. Maybe that's why this story still spans centuries with such strength, because it doesn't show perfect people receiving a glorious truth with impeccable composure. It shows ordinary people trying not to break down when everything inside them already seems disorganized. Evidence suggests that the collective memory of Jesus' early followers preserved with remarkable honesty their flaws, hesitations, and fears, something unusual in traditions that try to idealize their founding heroes. And that changes everything, because if they wanted to invent a beautiful version of themselves, they wouldn't have recorded the fear, the escape, the disbelief, the shame. But they left, and they left it because it was true. But here's what changes everything. The most important point is not that they broke. It's just that they weren't forever defined by the place they broke. The group that came out of those days was not a group that ever trembled. It was a group that had trembled, cried, fled, hesitated, and yet was found again by God. This means that Christian hope does not begin when you are whole. It begins when the presence of Christ reaches that part of you that is still trying to hide behind locked doors. Look closer at your own life. How many times have you also received something too big to process right away? How many times have you tried to appear strong while inside everything is still falling apart? How many times have you wanted to believe, but at the same time wanted to protect yourself? How many times has your pain spoken louder than your faith? How many times has your guilt tried to convince you that it was already too late to be restored? That's exactly where this story gets personal, because the disciples prove that fear does not automatically invalidate faith. The delay in processing does not cancel out the truth. Guilt does not end the calling, and a wounded heart is not beyond the reach of resurrection. Scholars estimate that the transformative power of the later apostolic witness only makes full sense when we recognize the depth of the earlier emotional disintegration. In other words, the courage we see later is only truly impressive when we remember how broken they were before. And perhaps the same is true of you. Perhaps what God is forming in your life can only be understood correctly when you stop hiding the parts where it still hurts. Because it was like that with them. First, the closed room. First, the confusion. First, the conflict. First, the guilt. First, the fear that doesn't go away at once. And only then, little by little, the reconstruction. This is the disconcerting beauty of the gospel. Jesus did not meet the disciples at the height of their performance. He met them on the emotional ground of their story. And it was there, not far from there, that he began to transform them, not denying the pain, no, or erasing the memory, but giving a new center to everything that seemed like ruin. So perhaps the more honest question is not just what the disciples did after the resurrection. Maybe the question is, what are you doing with what you haven't been able to process yet? Are you running away? Are you hiding? Are you trying to control the next step so you don't feel it? Are you living behind internal doors that no one sees? Or are you allowing Christ to enter the very place you tried to shield? If this story moved you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that God doesn't just work with strong people, but with real people. And I want to leave you with a question, not to answer quickly, but to really feel. What part of your life is still locked away by fear? And what would change if you finally let Christ in there?